Hi everybody, my name is Elizabeth and I'm a librarian here at the LSC Tomball Community Library. Welcome back to Baking is Making, the series where we only sometimes ever bake anything, but where we are always talking about food. As you may know from other episodes of Baking is Making, I don't eat meat. Vegetarianism and other plant-based diets may seem like something that's relatively new or trendy, but humans have been avoiding meat consumption for as long as there have been humans. This has been done for a variety of reasons, including often out of necessity. In places where plants have been very plentiful but meat might have been harder to come by, meat has been restricted to certain social or religious groups. In fact, the diets of the ancient Maya were very similar to that of contemporary vegans, centering around the three sisters of corn, squash, and beans. Meat was only ever regularly consumed by the aristocrats and royalty. Often though, meat consumption was limited on religious or philosophical grounds, as you can see with the ancient philosopher Pythagoras. Yes, the one who invented the thing about triangles. He actually led his own religious cult that advised vegetarianism, as he believed that all living things, including plants, had souls. Vegetarianism has also been a central function of many religious traditions throughout history, and Buddhists, Hindus, and Jains have all been vegetarian in varying forms or fashions across history. Although vegetarianism actually is not as cut and dry as it may seem, contemporary vegetarians often will avoid meat, shellfish, and poultry, but different kinds of vegetarians across history have eaten different kinds of things. For example, the Jains, who often are vegetarian as part of their religious practice, will also avoid onions and garlic, as you have to actually kill the entire plant to harvest garlic and onions to use in your food. Because of this, vegetarianism has had a remarkably wild and varied history, but most contemporary vegetarians don't eat meat out of either nutritional or ethical grounds, which is actually a relatively new phenomenon. And because of that, most 21st century vegetarians and vegans can actually trace our diets back to only about a couple hundred years ago. 21st century vegetarians can really owe our lifestyle in large parts to the Victorians. When I'm talking about the Victorians, I'm specifically talking about people who lived in the United Kingdom in the 19th century. This was the group that really pioneered being a vegetarian either for your health or because you saw slaughtering animals for food as being morally or ethically wrong. The Victorians were an incredibly health-conscious people, and were also very interested in social reform, particularly in getting rid of institutions that they saw to be morally wrong. This was also really one of the first times in history that we had a robust middle class living in cities. These people had disposable income and unprecedented control over their diets, so you can see how these factors can come together to create a time when vegetarianism could really flourish. As a plant-based person and also someone who finds the Victorians to be super interesting, I thought it would be fun to try and make a vegetarian recipe that was written in the Victorian era. Because of that, join me today as we attempt to make Mrs. E.W. Bowditch's recipe for haricot croquettes, or as she calls them, golden marbles, a vegetarian appetizer created in the Victorian era. This recipe is from Mrs. Bowditch's cookbook, New Vegetarian Dishes, which was published in 1892. This book was the product of its own health food fad, which was haricot beans. Although beans of this exact name are hard to come by nowadays, navy beans are a type of haricot and what we will be using today. Haricot beans were essentially the Victorian equivalent of kale or acai berries in that they were exceptionally trendy and were considered by Victorians to be extremely nutritious. In fact, the Victorians thought that haricot beans were such a superfood that of the recipes in New Vegetarian Dishes, 3 dozen of them include the haricot as an ingredient. This recipe is for a snack or appetizer that Bowditch calls golden marbles. The golden marbles are essentially bean and potato croquettes. They sound delicious and the name is absolutely adorable, so let's get started to get a taste of what vegetarians in the Victorian era were snacking on. To make golden marbles, you will need a 1/4 pound of your haricot. As I said before, we are going to be using navy beans, which I bought dried and then soaked overnight. You will also need 2 ounces of breadcrumbs. This recipe does not have a significant amount of seasoning in it, so I would recommend buying pre-seasoned breadcrumbs for this recipe. I used Italian breadcrumbs, but in hindsight, I think Parmesan would have probably been better. You will also need a 1/4 pound of mashed potatoes, 1 shallot, 1 egg, half a teaspoon of salt, and more breadcrumbs for coating. Following Mrs. Bowditch's recipe, the first thing we need to do is cook our beans. We are actually going to be mashing them later, so we want them to be pretty soft. After draining the soaking liquid away from the beans, I'm going to cook them on the stove in a large pot of salted water. The cooking method for beans is actually very similar to pasta, in that your teeth will know when they're cooked better than a timer will. I set my timer initially for an hour, but found that they took closer to an hour and 15 minutes. If you occasionally take a bean out of the pot and test it, you'll be able to tell when they're ready yourself. Once our beans are cooked, we're going to press them through a wire sieve to strain the pulp away from the shell. I'm gonna be honest, I'm not entirely sure why this step is here, aside from the fact that the outer shell of beans can be hard to digest, but pressing the beans through a wire sieve like I did is a ton of work, and I found it didn't make much of a difference in the final product. This recipe may be from the Victorian era, but we aren't, so save yourself the trouble and pulse your finished beans a few times in a food processor instead. Our next job is making mashed potatoes. Because the potatoes are going to be added to a dish rather than eaten on their own, I interpreted this as potatoes that are mashed rather than the cream and butter mashed potatoes we often eat as a side dish. I peeled my potatoes and added them to a large pot of salted water, cooking them for about 15 minutes. Once my potatoes were cooked, I added them to a mixing bowl and mashed them using my hand mixer. But obviously, whatever your preferred potato mashing method is, it will work fine. With both our beans and our potatoes ready to go, let's ready the rest of our ingredients. First, we need a shallot. Mrs. Bowditch recommended that it be finely minced, but my knife work isn't quite restaurant quality, particularly with something as small as a shallot, so I placed it in my food processor and would recommend you do the same if you have one on hand. Next, crack an egg and beat it, and add some breadcrumbs to a small dish or plate to ready your area to make the golden marbles. In your mixing bowl, combine your beans, potatoes, shallot, salt, breadcrumbs, and half of your beaten egg. You're going to be using your hands later anyway, so I would recommend forgoing a spoon or a spatula here and just mixing everything by hand. Once everything has been well combined, start shaping your mixture into balls, roughly marble-sized. Once they've all been shaped, roll them in the other half of your beaten egg and coat in the rest of your breadcrumbs. Our golden marbles are now ready to fry. Fry these as you feel most comfortable. Mrs. Bowditch intended them to be deep fried, but the blog I found this recipe on, Vintage Vegetarian Cuisine, pan fried them in about ½ an inch of oil. They recommend frying on either side for a couple of minutes before flipping, and your finished golden marbles should end up a gorgeous golden brown. I found that method worked fine for me, so I would recommend doing the same if you don't have a spare gallon of vegetable oil lying around. Once they're done, set them on a paper towel to drain and then serve immediately. These are delicious, and I could see them being a great appetizer or finger food at a party. The seasoning is pretty sparse, and these do come out fairly dry, so in the future I would probably serve them with some kind of dipping sauce. I think some kind of aioli would probably be perfect, although something like a chutney would add some nice brightness to what is a pretty dense dish on its own. Once you've got your golden marbles finished, you may find yourself as intrigued by the Victorians as I am. If that's the case, then I would recommend checking out How to Be a Victorian by Ruth Goodman. The Victorians lived very strict, regimented lives, and it is exactly this kind of lifestyle that created an environment where people would consider going vegetarian in large numbers. This book lays out a typical day in the life of a Victorian, and you can check it out from the Harris County Public Library. Thank you for watching this episode of Baking is Making. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter so that you never miss a future episode of Baking is Making or any of our other great online programs. Also, let me know if there's any other interesting historical recipes you'd like me to try. I thought this was really fun and very intriguing, so I would certainly be interested in trying more recipes from the past in the future. Thank you again for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye!